So let us get into it. We want to welcome to the show the founder and managing director at Animation Research Ltd. It is Sir Ian Taylor in Dunedin with us, of course. Ian, welcome to the show.
Kia ora, how are you?
Good, very good. Thank you so much for joining us, and thank you for being with us. And look, all three of us in Dunedin. So we cover the world. Yep, from Dunedin to the world. Right, so let's look at this, Ian, because it's a really interesting story. And you gave me the link. Which there it is there. Sorry, it's the wrong part of my thing. An open letter. This is an open letter on tax that has been written, and there are a bunch of signatories, including yourself, who have signed up to it. A whole bunch of things in here talking about the idea that, and I'll say the wealthy, but I guess we got to say the 100-odd people listed in this letter. They're saying this, but I guess they're professing the idea that maybe the wealthy can pay a bit more tax. Do you want to maybe nutshell it a bit for us and tell us about what the letter's about and why you signed on?
Well, I think it's interesting even being sort of targeted there as the wealthy. You know, I don't think of myself as wealthy. I think there's a bigger question. I've always wondered, you know, why we always talk about the tax burden, and you know, you're always hiring accountants to alleviate your tax and do things like that. And I remember many years ago employing two young Swedish postgraduates who'd actually gone to college in the States with my son. And we hired them we wanted them to work on our international golf around the world. And one of the options we looked at with them, just sort of maybe make it easier for them, was that we could look at seeing how we set things up in New Zealand for them so they pay tax in New Zealand because they'd be paying less than they paid in Sweden. And I will never forget their response. I mean, it was simply a no to that. They said, you know, we will pay our tax in Sweden. That's what we do. And, you know, we owe everybody who's paid tax for the position we've got to now. You know, we've got health, we've got really great education systems. It's part of the social contract. And we're happy to pay the tax back to those who have paid before, that got us here, and forward for the people who will be coming. That's what tax does. That's what you need to run a country, for those huge bits of the country that need to be built to run the infrastructure, health, education. And I've never forgotten it. They were proud to pay tax. And I guess when I was approached about this, my first question was, how did I end up on the wealthy list? And, but it was really encouraging discussion. And it's kind of interesting because before I was called about it, I had started to write an article which was Let's Talk About Tax. And it had nothing to do. And I actually took it off, Let's Talk About Tax, baby. Salt and pepper song. Yeah, let's talk about sex, that other three-letter word. Yeah, and I just tried to open up this discussion that says, look, you know, I've been looking at the way tax works, and it doesn't seem to work very well. I know when I came through, I didn't, you know, taxes paid for my university education. I got that for free. I used to go to the hospitals whenever I needed to, you know, when my kids needed hospital. But as the times moved on, there's this enormous gap in the sort of economic relationships in the country. There are people who are really suffering. And if we want to talk about tax burdens, then the tax burdens the burden is on those people who can't feed their kids, those people who can't clothe their kids, those people who can't go to hospitals because the waiting queues are too long. And those are part of I might be naive, but that's part of the social contract we have to run a country. You know, I drove on those roads when I was a teenager. I got my license on those roads when I was a teenager. So for me, it wasn't a very big deal. I was hoping that let's start this conversation about being proud to pay tax, and then looking at the different options to fix the system so we weren't looking at the poverty that we've got and the people currently who just can't feed their kids.
I've been listening and reading quite a lot to this in the last sort of 24 hours. And it feels very much that you in particular, but I think probably as a group, are coming at this from a non-partisan position. That would be fair?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
There's a huge mix of people through this. And, my hope was more that we wanted to start a conversation about this. Let's talk about this. And I guess, I might get into trouble here. One of the disappointing things for me about the letter is that, for me, that social contract goes two ways.
Yeah.
We've got a whole pile of politicians out there who seem to be pretty reckless in the way they spend the money. I did just use the one example here in Dunedin of a $27 million consultancy bill paid to try to take $80 million off a hospital that we need. And I imagine the reason they're trying to cut it is we don't collect enough tax to pay for the hospitals. I'll just give you an example of that. I heard before I went on an interview with Heather Duplessis. Before she got to me, she led in with the story about all the doctors and nurses heading off overseas to Australia because they get paid more. What we didn't talk about was the fact that maybe one of the reasons they get paid more is they collect 19 billion in GST.
Yeah.
And that 19 billion in GST, capital gains tax.
Yep.
But the important thing about that is their GST is only 12%. Ours is one of the highest in the world. So this isn't just a discussion about paying more tax. It's about where do we shift tax so that who do we relieve it? Whose tax do we relieve so they can afford to feed themselves? And GST is one of the biggest of those.
Yeah, the letter, amongst many things, also says, talking about paying more tax and what tax is, it says it funds everything from the teachers who give our children a great start to the DOC rangers or DOC rangers who look after our environment, through to the healthcare professionals, which is sort of what you were just saying, on whom we can all rely. And we are, like in this show, we even though we overtly come from the left, Chewy and I politically, we always play each ball on its merits, and we criticise where appropriate, we congratulate where appropriate. I wouldn't say we're non-partisan, but when I look at the political spectrum right now and we hear people like David Seymour speaking directly to you guys who are signatories saying this, it's always been such a lame, humble brag. I'm so rich, I want to pay more tax. You know what? If they want to help other people, they can very happily put their hands in their own pockets right now. The fact that they are wealthy doesn't mean they know more about policies. It does mean that they've got the ability to put their hand in their own pocket and help others should they choose. The fact that they are not doing that and trying to make a statement about how rich they are tells you a bit more about them, frankly. So whilst the idea of it being non-partisan...
I know, it's amazing, isn't it?
It's amazing. It's fantastic.
No, but you go and then I'll respond.
I was just going to say, even though you're talking about it being non-partisan, there is a spectre within the political and within the spectrum of politics, or where people sit, where this doesn't seem like it would ever sit. So that kind of it feels like it kind of becomes partisan even though you don't want it to be. But you tell me, respond to Mr. Seymour.
This stuff, I think that's, I was at a conference the other day. It was really interesting. I was speaking at the Deer Farmers Conference and Beef and Lamb. And, what we're starting to see is this partisan tribal thing starting to happen where people get into their little knots and then blame other people for everything. They have their views. But, I was staggered by this approach from David because, the very first answer to that is, yes, David, that's what hundreds of these wealthy people do. They do put their hands in their pockets. There are millions of dollars in charitable donations that are made every year by people like those people on the list who are filling enormous holes that the government and politicians can't fill or don't seem to have the ability to fill. And, maybe, one of the things, he says that maybe this open letter says more about the wealthy than it does, or whatever it is. One of the things that's left out in the letter is one of the biggest beneficiaries of the taxes that get paid are people like David Seymour. He gets paid by the taxes. He works for us. His superannuation scheme, which he will collect for the rest of his life, is paid by taxes. And those taxes, just so that we're really clear, those taxes are the results of successful people. I don't call them rich. a lot of people you don't have to be rich to think like this, but successful people, all those taxes are the result of people who've taken risks, made investments, created businesses that create jobs that people pay tax from. So it all comes back to people who make money. So, and the irony is those business people and all those people who've paid tax that goes to the politicians, they're taking it after we've paid tax on it. We've given them the money from our taxes, and then they think they're doing a really good job by taking it back again. That's the discussion we need to have, because nurses, doctors, all of those people are actually coming out of the taxes that are the results of people who've created jobs that allow people to make money and pay taxes. But this isn't, and I think the thing that's broken about the system is the fact that the taxes come off kind of wage and salaries. So it doesn't touch anything. And I remember I accidentally got into owning a building with a partner here in Dunedin. I remember thinking, what have I done? And the building cost maybe $600,000 at the time, and we used it for our office space. We needed a space. But then, 6 or 7 years later, someone turned up and offered us millions of dollars for it. And we sold it. And in my naivety, I said to the partner I was with, so how much tax do we pay on this?
Yeah.
And it was nothing.
Yeah.
And I couldn't understand that. It was, it was money I didn't do a lot for. It grew for whatever reasons, and I get to keep it all.
Sure, you want to jump in with anything?
Yeah, I mean, I've been looking. One of our regular listeners sent me something on Twitter the other day, and he unfortunately made me give some credit to Rob Muldoon, which made me feel very yucky. But he was pointing out the fact that Rob Muldoon put up the top tax rate in the mid-'80s to, I think it was something like 66%. And then when Labor came in, there were a dramatic series of changes. They cut that top tax rate to, I think, 33. They brought in GST. Roger Douglas is swinging his axe left, right, and centre. And in amongst that, like you were talking about selling this property, there were big changes in investing in property, and that created that huge tax loophole where, as you mentioned, people were buying up property, selling it, and there's absolutely no tax on the capital gains. But it was all seen as GST is a very fair way to administer tax. And so therefore we can keep the tax rates really low. And I think here we are decades later seeing that doesn't work. Do you think we're at a place where we can have a serious discussion about what needs to happen with tax, or is it just going to be a case of like, we'll move the tax bands around a bit and it'll all be sweet? Yeah.
Well, I mean, I'm just ever hopeful that we can have discussions, and it falls into a very simple. I looked up where the tax goes. So we collect about 113 billion a year in tax, and I think one of the first questions is that, which I think was sad that was left out of the letter. I think, as I said, there is a requirement that before people start paying more tax, we look at the tax that's being paid and ask ourselves and ask politicians, are you spending it well? And, over the past few years, you have to doubt a lot of that expenditure. Who knows? 113 billion a year might be enough, but I doubt it. So when I looked at where the money is spent, the biggest amount of that 113 billion, just about 50 billion of it, is spent on social welfare. So there are a number of questions we ask about that. What are we going to do? You're going to actually cut that money that gets spent on social welfare on the people who need it? Or are we going to look at how we actually deal to that? Maybe how tax gets spent better so that we get more of those people working, that we get them off welfare. But the whole idea that you just cut that kind of spending, because the next biggest one was health, and I think it was at about 20 billion, 18 billion, and we're seeing that collapse around our ears. So there's obviously either not enough money going in there, or the money that's going in isn't being spent well. And then the third biggest one is education, and that was 17 billion. And we see the teachers out marching because they aren't being paid what they're worth. They need to be paid. So if I was talking to Christopher Luxon, say, you are a businessman, you ran some major businesses, and your big driver was income. Where does the money come that you bring into the company? And really, that's what a country is. There's a big part of the country that needs to be run like a business, where you've got to bring in income from somewhere to pay for all of those things that these kind of wealthy, successful people reaching into their own pockets can't pay for. So those millions of dollars are getting paid on things like school kids' lunches, kids who are starving. I work with Mike King on Gumboot Friday, I Am Hope. There's lots of donations made from wealthy people and ordinary people who are trying to fill a hole that the government hasn't filled in youth mental health. But that no businessman can actually pay money in or donate to build a new road, build a new hospital, pay for teachers, pay for doctors. That's government responsibility. It's all of our responsibilities. And we need to look at a tax system that people are proud to be part of.
Yeah. Hey, Ian, Philip's waiting for us in the waiting room, so we better go and grab him as well. But I do want to ask you one more question, because you've been fairly vocal about your disquiet, displeasure, frustration with what's happening within government spending and the government in general at the moment. You've been writing about it, you've been talking about it. However, what you're also talking about with paying more tax doesn't seem to sit very well on the opposite side of the political spectrum to who's in now, who's causing you frustration. Just in a sentence or less sort of thing, what do you do at this upcoming election?
I really don't know. I've been a Labour supporter nearly all my life. Twice. I once voted for the Māori Party and I once voted for National, because this isn't about party politics. It's about, you look and think, who's going to solve this problem? And it's not about me. And I love Bill English's introduction that if we're going to spend social money, there needs to be a social return on money. And I just thought, that is a long time overdue. You deserve my support. So now what I will be looking for is parties out there who are going to try to fix this issue, because the other looming issue is the cost of global change, climate change, global warming, sustainability. That's going to be a huge cost, and it's got to be borne by the country. Yeah.
So Ian Taylor, hey, thank you so much for joining us. We might see you down at St Clair for a beer one day or something. Is that how it works when we're all in Dunedin?
Thanks,
Ian. All the best. Appreciate your time.